The Galactic Imperium slaughtered 1.2 billion live on air, then Earth unleashed its wrath. The coffee mug was still warm in my hand when every screen in the building turned red. Not an alarm. Not a test. Every screen, every tablet, every phone, every digital surface in the entire United Nations complex in Geneva went red at the same moment, and then that red faded to black, and something appeared that did not look human. It was tall. Easily 3 meters. Its skin was the color of polished bone, smooth and pale, with faint lines running along its jaw and neck that pulsed with a dim blue light. It wore armor that looked like it had been grown rather than built, layered plates that shifted when it moved, and its eyes were the strangest part, 2 flat discs of silver that reflected the room around it like mirrors. It had no mouth that I could see, and yet when it spoke, the sound came from everywhere at once, as if the air itself was forming words. It spoke in perfect English. Not accented English. Not translated English. Perfect English, with rhythm and tone and the slight pause before a difficult word that a careful speaker uses when they want to be clearly understood. People of Earth, it said. My name is Lord Commander Vale of the Galactic Imperium. I have studied your language for 48 of your hours, and I have studied your civilization for 31 of your years. I know your history. I know your conflicts. I know your weapons and your governments and your philosophers and your prayers. I know everything that you are. I set the coffee mug down. My hands were not shaking yet. That surprised me. And having studied you in full, Vale continued, the Galactic Imperium has reached a judgment. Your species has been assessed as biologically redundant. Your genetic structure offers nothing to the broader catalog of life in this galaxy that is not already present in 47 other recorded species. Your cognitive patterns are derivative. Your social structures are primitive and unstable. And your territorial footprint, while currently limited to a single planetary body, presents a long-term risk to civilizations that have already advanced beyond your stage. My name is Dara Osei. At the time, I was a sergeant working as a liaison officer for the UN's Department of Diplomatic Relations, which sounds impressive but mostly meant I organized meetings and translated documents and occasionally fetched coffee for people who were far more important than I was. I was 32 years old. I had a flat in the old part of Geneva, a cat named Pepper, and a younger brother named Colin who was studying medicine in Nairobi. I tell you this because I want you to understand what ordinary looked like. What the world looked like in the moment before it changed. Vale raised one hand, long fingers spreading wide, and the image behind him shifted. It was a view from orbit. I recognized the curvature of the Earth immediately, the blue and white of it, the thin line of atmosphere that always looks so fragile from space. Arranged in a precise arc above the planet were 17 ships. I had no frame of reference for their size at first, not until one of them drifted close to a weather satellite and I realized that the ship was longer than some cities. 17 of them. Sitting above us like mountains that had learned to float. These vessels, Vale said calmly, are positioned above your most densely populated regions. Each one carries a planetary restructuring array. You do not have a word in any of your languages for what these arrays do, so I will use the closest approximation: they erase. They restructure matter at a fundamental level, converting organic and inorganic material alike into a form of dispersed energy that is not recoverable. The room around me had gone completely silent. I could hear someone breathing very fast somewhere behind me. I could hear the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady in a way that felt almost wrong given the circumstances. You have 60 of your seconds, Vale said, to broadcast a signal of unconditional surrender on all available frequencies. If you do this, the restructuring process will be limited to depopulation rather than full planetary conversion, and a portion of your population will be retained for integration into Imperium labor programs. If you do not surrender, we will proceed with full restructuring. He paused. The silver eyes did not blink. I want to be clear, he added. This broadcast is being transmitted to every civilization in this galaxy simultaneously. Every species capable of receiving a signal is watching this moment. This is not only a message to you. It is a demonstration. What happens next will determine how 63 other civilizations respond to the Imperium in the coming decades. I recommend you choose wisely. 60 seconds. You would think a species would surrender. You would think the rational thing, the logical thing, the merciful thing for itself would be to take the option that kept some people alive. And maybe it would have happened that way. Maybe someone would have found the right frequency and broadcast the right signal, except that the governments of Earth were still arguing over who had the legal authority to make that call. The United Nations Security Council could not reach a quorum because 2 of the 5 permanent members were still trying to reach their heads of state by phone. The President of the United States was in a secure bunker being briefed on something that everyone had already seen. 3 different nations had already fired missiles at the ships, missiles that simply stopped working about 800 kilometers up, their electronics dead, their momentum carrying them forward until they drifted harmlessly into the upper atmosphere and burned. 60 seconds passed. The ships fired. I cannot describe it well because the cameras that would have given us the best view stopped transmitting within the first few seconds. What I can tell you is what the data showed afterward. 11 minutes and 43 seconds of continuous planetary restructuring arrays operating at what Vale later confirmed was 40% capacity, because he had not wanted to cause tectonic damage that would have made the remaining land uninhabitable. 40% was enough. Asia Pacific. South Asia. East Africa. The arrays did not distinguish between cities and countryside, between young and old, between anyone. They were not designed to. 1.2 billion people. The screens went dark. Vale's image disappeared. The transmission ended. And then the whole building filled with a sound I had never heard before and have never heard since. It was not screaming. It was not crying. It was something deeper than both of those things, a sound that came from every person in that building at once, a sound that had no word for it in any language I know, the sound of a wound opening in the air. I did not make that sound. I stood very still with my empty coffee mug in my hand, and I watched the dark screens, and I thought about my brother Colin in Nairobi. The arrays had covered East Africa. I stood there for a long time. The people around me moved and talked, and someone started giving orders and someone else started crying, and the whole building began to spin up into emergency protocols, and I stood in the middle of it and held my coffee mug and did not move. At some point, a woman named Grace put her hand on my shoulder. She was one of the senior diplomatic staff, a decade older than me, and she had lost people too. I could see it in her face. "Oh, say," she said. "I need you with me." I set the coffee mug down on the nearest desk. "Yes," I said. "Okay." Vale had told 63 other civilizations what humanity would do when faced with the end. He had made a demonstration of it, broadcast across the entire galaxy. He had made one error in that plan. He had not considered what humanity would do next. He was about to find out. The silence started about 3 hours after the broadcast ended. Not in the building. The UN complex was loud for days, full of people making calls and holding emergency sessions and issuing statements that nobody outside the building was reading because the world outside was not in a state that cared about statements. The silence, was different. It was the silence that fell over the military frequencies. The encrypted government channels. The networks that foreign intelligence services monitored constantly and used to gauge the mood of nations. All of it went quiet. I noticed it first because it was my job to listen. 6 hours after the broadcast, I was sitting in the signals room on the 3rd floor with a pair of headphones around my neck and a screen full of monitored frequencies in front of me, and the woman next to me, a signals analyst named Helen, looked up from her own screen and said, very quietly, "They've all stopped talking." She meant the militaries. The governments. The people who, in every previous crisis in human history, generated enormous amounts of radio traffic, encrypted signals, scrambled communications, constant chatter between commanders and capitals and field units. In every war, every conflict, every international incident of the last century, the one thing that never stopped was the noise of governments talking to each other. "What does that mean?" asked the young man on my other side. His name was Owen, and he was new, 3 months into his posting, and he still asked questions out loud when more experienced people had learned to sit with the uncertainty. Helen looked at him. Then she looked at me. I think we both understood it at the same moment, because we had both been doing this long enough to recognize what the silence meant. "It means they've stopped arguing," I said. In the 36 hours that followed, I pieced together what was happening through fragments. A general I knew from a previous posting called me, not on an official line, on my personal phone, and said 3 words before hanging up, look underground, oh say. An encrypted file arrived on a secure server that I technically should not have had access to, but someone had decided I needed to see it, and it contained a single data summary from 3 separate weapons development programs, one American, one Chinese, one Russian, each operating in total isolation from the other 2, each starting from different raw data and different theoretical frameworks. All 3 had arrived at the same solution. The Imperium's hull shielding operated on a resonance principle. The shields were not a barrier in the traditional sense. They were a frequency wall, a band of energy that caused incoming objects to lose momentum and coherence before they made contact. Every missile, every projectile, every energy weapon that humanity had tested against the ships in the first hours after the broadcast had failed for the same reason. Our weapons operated within the frequency range that the shields were tuned to absorb. But the 3 separate teams had found the gap. There was a narrow band of frequency, very high, very specific, that the shields did not cover. Not because the Imperium had overlooked it, but because generating a weapon that operated in that band required a power source that, as far as Imperium science was concerned, no civilization at our stage of development was capable of producing. They were wrong. Not by much. Humanity was not, in any normal sense, capable of producing that power source. But grief, it turns out, does something to human beings that is very difficult to quantify scientifically. It compresses time. It eliminates hesitation. It removes the normal social and institutional barriers that slow down research, because the people doing the research have stopped caring about credit, about career, about the peer review process, about anything except the problem in front of them. 3 teams, each one burning with the same fire, each one working through the night and the next day and the night after that, each one arriving at the same answer from a different direction. I read that file 3 times. Then I deleted it the way I had been trained to and went to find Grace. She already knew. Of course she did. How long? I asked her. 18 days, she said. Maybe 20. I thought about that. The Imperium had scheduled their formal occupation for 30 days out. Vale had announced it at the end of the broadcast, almost casually, the way you announce an appointment. He was coming to Earth in 30 days to formalize the transition. 30 days felt like a mercy, I thought at the time. Now I understood it differently. 30 days was how long it took to move the administrative infrastructure of an occupation. He was not giving us time. He simply did not need to hurry. 18 days. What's happening underground? I asked. Grace looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "Come with me." She took me down 4 levels below the UN complex, to a section of the building I had never been in before, and then through a door that required her handprint and a code that she entered herself, not trusting me to see it. The room on the other side was a communications hub, and it was connected to something I had not known existed, a network of secure lines running to equivalent bunkers under military installations on 6 continents. What they showed me on those screens was what humanity had been doing while the world thought we were breaking down. Every industrial complex on Earth that could be repurposed was being repurposed. Not slowly. Not through the usual process of government contracts and procurement cycles and budget debates. People were just doing it. Factory workers who had come in to find their managers gone were running the machines themselves. Engineers who had lost families were sleeping under their workbenches. Supply chains that normally took months to reorganize had been reorganized in days, because the people who ran them had stopped waiting for approval. It was not organized in the traditional sense. There was no single commander, no single plan being executed from the top down. It was more like watching a colony of organisms respond to a threat, each part of the system reacting to what it could see, and the result, somehow, was coherence. A man named Arthur who ran logistics coordination for the European Industrial Network showed me a production summary. He had not slept in 40 hours and his eyes were red, but his voice was completely steady. He walked me through the numbers with the calm precision of someone who had decided that emotion was a thing to be stored away until there was time for it. Owen, the young signals analyst, appeared at my shoulder at some point and looked at the production numbers and said, "That's not possible. You can't scale up that fast." Arthur looked at him. 3 weeks ago, he said, you couldn't have told me what a planetary restructuring array was either. I thought about that for a long time afterward. Vale's observation drones were watching the surface of the Earth. His analysts were filing reports that said what his models predicted they would say, social collapse, civil unrest, fragmented governmental response, no coherent military mobilization. All of that was true on the surface. Literally on the surface. Because that was all his drones could see. On the surface, humanity looked broken. Below it, in the mines and the bunkers and the repurposed factory floors and the underground research stations and the emergency manufacturing plants that had once been subway depots and parking structures and storage facilities, humanity was doing what it had always done when something tried to destroy it. It was building. I sent a message to Grace that night. One line. She replied in 4 words. My message: what do we do when it's ready? Her reply: we take it to them. I read that and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the ventilation system hum, thinking about Colin, thinking about my cat Pepper, who was still in my Geneva flat and who, I had been informed, had been looked after by my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Edna, who had apparently decided that caring for other people's pets was the most useful thing she could do in a crisis, and I thought that Edna was probably right, and I thought that Colin would have laughed at that, and then I stopped thinking about it and went back to work. 21 nations signed the Unified Command document that night. Not a treaty. Not an alliance with articles and subclauses and exit provisions. 1 page. 1 paragraph. 7 sentences. The last sentence read, all resources of all signatory nations are hereby committed in their entirety to a single coordinated response, to be determined by the Joint Command. By morning, 49 nations had signed it. By the following evening, every nation on Earth had signed it. It had taken 12 days after the broadcast to get every government on Earth to agree on a single piece of paper. I remember thinking that this was, by historical standards, extraordinarily fast. Usually it took decades. Vale's probe network reported no military mobilization. His analysts upgraded their confidence estimate that Earth would not mount a meaningful resistance. He sent a communication to his forward administrative staff, proceed as scheduled. He was coming in 18 days. We had 17. The dark side of the moon does not look the way most people imagine it. There is a version of it in popular imagination, smooth and mysterious and silvery, the hidden face that never turns toward Earth. The reality, when you see it for the first time from the surface, is rougher. Cratered and ancient, gray rock and shadow, a landscape that looks like it has been through something terrible and survived. I thought, standing there in my suit with the Earth a blue curve above the horizon behind me, that this was an appropriate place for what we had built. Because what we had built on the dark side of the moon was not small. A woman named Clara, who was the site commander, met me at the airlock and walked me out onto the surface without preamble, because there was no time for preamble and she was not the kind of person who used it anyway. Clara was 61 years old, compact and direct, with short white hair and hands that had done physical work for most of her life and showed it. She had been a mining engineer before all of this. I had been told she had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in the last 11 days. I believed it. She pointed, and I looked, and I stopped walking. The installation stretched across the surface in both directions as far as I could see. Launch cradles by the hundreds, spaced in precise intervals across the gray rock, each one cradling a vehicle that ranged in size from a small aircraft to something larger than any building I had ever stood next to. The scale was not something you could absorb at once. Your mind kept trying to reduce it to something familiar and kept failing. How? I asked. It was not a complete question, but Clara understood it. The same way everything gets built, she said. You break it into pieces small enough for a person to do, and then you find enough people who are willing. The people who had built this were still here, many of them. I saw them moving between the structures in their suits, working in pairs and small teams, checking connections and running calibrations and doing the 10,000 small tasks that keep a large machine operational. Miners from Siberia and Canada. Engineers from Germany and South Korea. Welders from Brazil and Indonesia. Robotic specialists from Japan. Software architects from India. People who had come here with whatever skills they had and applied them to whatever needed doing. A young man named Pete, maybe 25, was running a cable junction 3 meters from where I was standing. He had a photo printed on the inside of his helmet visor, the way some people put photos of their families, visible to them as a reminder of why they were doing what they were doing. I could not see it clearly. I did not ask. Clara took me to the briefing room, which was a pressurized module buried into the rock, and she showed me the plan. It was not a plan in the sense of a document. It was a system. A web of interdependent actions, each one triggering the next, with branches and contingencies and fallback positions mapped out to 3 levels of depth. It had been designed by a committee of military strategists, physicists, logistics experts, and 2 game theorists who had apparently been very useful, and it had been refined continuously over the last 10 days as new information came in. The core insight was this: the Imperium fought the way powerful civilizations always fight. With overwhelming force applied at the front. Massed fleets, overwhelming shield strength, hierarchical command structures that could coordinate thousands of ships in precise formations. It was a way of fighting that had worked for 4,000 years against every enemy they had ever encountered, because every enemy they had encountered had tried to match them at their own game. Humanity was not going to match them at their own game. A general named Victor, who commanded the coordinated response from a secondary bunker on the lunar surface, explained it to me with the patience of someone who had given this speech many times. He was a large man, quieter than you would expect from someone in his position, with a habit of pausing before he answered any question as if he was reading it twice. "We are slower than they are," he said. "Our ships cannot match their shields in direct confrontation. We cannot outproduce them. We cannot outgun them in a conventional engagement. None of that is relevant." "Why not?" I asked. "Because we are not trying to win a conventional engagement," he said. "We are trying to make them stop." He explained the biology of it, and I thought about it for a long time afterward. Humanity had evolved as persistence hunters. Our distant ancestors had hunted by following prey across open ground for hours, sometimes days, wearing it down not through superior speed or strength but through the simple refusal to stop. We were not the fastest species on our own planet. We were not the strongest. But we were the ones who kept going when everything else had exhausted itself. We had brought that into space. Our vehicles were not the fastest in engagement. But they carried more fuel per unit mass than anything in the Imperium's catalog, because we had learned to maximize endurance over speed. Our crew compartments were designed for long-duration operation in ways the Imperium had never bothered with, because no engagement in Imperium history had ever lasted long enough to make crew endurance a factor. Our systems had layers of redundancy that added weight and complexity but meant that a ship could take significant damage and keep functioning. We did not retreat. Not as a tactical decision. As a design choice. There were no protocols in the new fleet's command systems for withdrawal. A ship moved forward or it held position. That was all. Victor showed me the second element of the plan, and this one made the back of my neck feel cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. A captured Imperium observation drone, recovered from the upper atmosphere 11 days earlier, had been reverse-engineered by a team of 12 people working without sleep in a laboratory in New Mexico. The electronics were unlike anything human-made, but the fundamental principles were not as alien as expected. It had taken 8 days to understand the basic architecture. 3 more to access its communication protocols. 2 more after that to rewrite them. The drone had, among its navigational files, a full position map of the Imperium fleet. Including the Eternal Throne, Vale's command vessel, which was sitting 40 astronomical units from Earth, far behind the front formation, unguarded by anything more than a standard escort of 6 patrol craft. Because nothing had ever gotten past the Imperium's front line. The Eternal Throne was enormous and powerful and essentially undefended, because in 4,000 years, no enemy had made it necessary to defend a command vessel. You defended the front. Everything behind the front was, by definition, safe. Victor looked at me after he finished the explanation. He had the expression of someone who has decided to say something directly rather than work up to it. "I want you on the insertion team," he said. I looked at him. "I'm a liaison officer." "You were," he said. "The team needs someone who has actually spoken to Vale, who has watched him, who understands something about how he thinks." The briefing analysts gave me a list of names. Yours was at the top. "What are the odds?" He did not insult me by softening it. By conventional calculation, the team should not make it past the escort ships. I thought about Colin. I thought about Pete and the photo in his helmet visor and all the people on the surface of this moon who had built something impossible in 2 weeks because they had nothing left to lose except the future. "Okay," I said, before he finished the sentence. Victor nodded. He did not say thank you. There was not really a framework for thank you in this context. He moved to the next item in the briefing. There were 8 people on the insertion team. I knew 2 of them, Owen, the young signals analyst from Geneva who had stopped asking questions out loud and started answering them, and a woman named B who had been a structural engineer in Melbourne and who had retrained on the new weapon systems in 9 days and was now, by technical assessment, one of the 12 best operators on the moon. The others were specialists of various kinds, each chosen for a specific function. Our pilot was a man named Ray who had the stillness of someone who had been afraid so many times that fear had become a baseline he no longer registered. Our ship was a captured Imperium resupply drone, the largest of the 3 that had been brought down intact. It had been repainted with the registry codes of an active Imperium logistics vessel. From the outside, at a distance, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like. From the inside, it had been rebuilt almost entirely, the cargo space converted to crew quarters and weapons storage, the navigation system running alongside our own in a parallel architecture that Ray had designed himself over 6 days. We went over the plan until I could have recited it backwards. We drilled in the corridors of the lunar base until the movements were automatic. We ate together and slept in the same module, and in the mornings, before the day started, a few of us would stand at the viewport and look at the Earth and not say anything. There was nothing to say that the looking did not already cover. The day we launched, Clara shook each of our hands at the airlock. She had the grip of someone who builds things, firm and certain. "Bring him back breathing," she said. "We need him to be seen." I understood why she said that. The galaxy was still watching. It had watched Vale take everything from us. What happened next needed to be seen too. We came in under the ecliptic plane, running on minimum power, following a trajectory that Ray had calculated to look, to any monitoring system, like a piece of debris on a long orbital curve. The insertion approach took 19 hours. We did not speak much. There was nothing useful to say, and everything that needed saying had been said. The battle began at 0400 hours Earth Standard Time, and it began 32 seconds early because Owen, who was monitoring the trigger point, looked at his screen and said quietly, "It's time," and Ray's hand was already on the controls. Not because Owen had given the order. Because Ray had seen what Owen was seeing, and for a human being looking at that screen in that moment, waiting another 32 seconds was simply not possible. That is something you need to understand about the way humans fight. We have protocols and timing and precise coordination, and all of it matters, and all of it is also subject to the moment when a person looks at a screen and knows in their body that now is the time. Military commanders have been dealing with this for thousands of years. The best ones learn to account for it. From 40 astronomical units away, we felt nothing. We heard it on the communications intercept system, fragments of Imperium tactical traffic that Owen was monitoring and translating in real time, and the fragments told us enough. Earth's full launch had activated. 40,000 vehicles of various types, emerging from the dark side of the moon in a spread formation that the Imperium's tactical systems categorized as unprecedented. Not because of the numbers alone, but because of the pattern. It did not look like a military formation. It did not look like any attack profile in the Imperium's 4,000-year tactical library. It looked, one Imperium analyst apparently noted in a transmission that Owen intercepted and translated with a slight smile, like a wave. A natural phenomenon rather than a coordinated one. Something that grew out of a coastline when the conditions were right. The Imperium's response AI paused for 0.3 seconds to recalculate. In space combat at the velocities involved, 0.3 seconds is an eternity. The first wave was already inside the shield formation's optimal response perimeter before the order to engage had fully propagated through the command hierarchy. Ray brought our ship into the Eternal Throne's docking bay at 0417 hours, matching registry codes and approach vector and docking protocol precisely, because we had memorized the protocol from the drone's onboard systems and read it aloud to Ray 3 times in the last hour of approach, and Ray had absorbed it the way Ray absorbed everything, completely and without comment. The bay was enormous. It was designed for vessels much larger than ours, and we sat in it like a grain of rice in a bowl. The internal lighting was low and cool, that same blue-white that Imperium spaces always used, and there were docking arms moving toward our hull automatically, because the system saw a registry-valid resupply drone and responded accordingly. We moved the moment the outer bay door closed. There were 8 of us. The Eternal Throne had a crew of approximately 1,100. Those were the numbers. They are not the whole story. The whole story is that the Eternal Throne had never been boarded. Not once in 4,000 years of operation. The crew were administrators and technical specialists and command staff, people who worked in the center of the safest place in the Imperium's operational theater. They had drills. They had protocols for emergency situations. They did not have protocols for 8 human beings moving through their corridors with total commitment and no intention of stopping. The first corridor we entered was empty. The second had 2 crew members who saw us and froze for 3 full seconds, long enough for Owen to move them to a side alcove and seal the door. B had the corridor map on a screen strapped to her forearm, updating in real time from the drone's navigational files, and she moved with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has stopped wasting energy on anything else. The Eternal Throne was beautiful. I noticed this even in the moment, even moving fast, even with everything at stake. The corridors were wide and vaulted and the walls had a texture that caught the light in shifting patterns, organic and deliberate at the same time. The floors were a deep gray material that made no sound under our feet. The whole ship felt like it had been built by people who understood that the place you lived was a statement about who you believed yourself to be. We were not gentle with it. The bridge was on the 7th level, central mass, exactly where the drone's files had shown it. The security door was substantial, 2 layers, with a biometric lock on the interior side. B looked at it for about 4 seconds, made a sound that was not quite a word, and began working. Ray stood at the corridor junction behind us and watched both directions with the stillness of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and has learned to be comfortable in the waiting. Pete would have been useful on the bridge door, I thought, and then I stopped thinking about Pete and focused. The door opened in 9 minutes. B did not celebrate. She stepped back and I went through first, because it was decided that I would go through first, since I had seen Vale before, since I was the one who had been chosen to do the talking, if talking was what was needed. The bridge was not what I expected. I had imagined something like a human command center, screens and stations and people at consoles. It was quieter than that, and more open, a wide circular space with a domed ceiling that showed a live external view of space, stars, and the distant glint of the main battle formation, and in the center, raised slightly above the floor on a platform of the same gray material as the corridors, was a single large seat. And in the seat was Vale. He was not alone. There were 12 crew members at stations around the perimeter, and they were all looking at us now, that silver disc gaze taking us in with an expression I could not read because I did not have enough experience with those faces. But Vale, I could read. Or I thought I could. He looked at us with what I can only describe as interest. Not alarm. Not anger. Interest. He studied our 8 faces, our mismatched equipment, the mix of tools and weapons we were carrying, the fact that 2 of us were bleeding from minor injuries sustained in the corridors, the fact that we were breathing harder than we would have liked, the fact that we were standing on the bridge of his flagship in the middle of a battle that his forces were currently losing the initiative in, and he looked genuinely interested. "You are the liaison officer," he said, looking directly at me. He had a voice designed for accuracy, each word landing with precision. "I saw your file." "Oh, say." "Sergeant, United Nations Diplomatic Relations." "That's right," I said. "You boarded this vessel with 8 people," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The dome above us showed the battle in the distance, small lights moving in patterns that, from here, looked almost peaceful. His fleet was engaged. His tactical systems were dealing with something unprecedented. And he was sitting on his bridge, looking at us with those flat silver eyes, and the thing I remember most is that he did not seem frightened. "You are magnificently irrational," he said. Not as an insult. As an observation. "We've been told that before," I said. Not by someone who meant it as a compliment, he said. I took a breath. "Lord Commander Vale. I am placing you under the authority of the Joint Earth Command. You will order your fleet to cease engagement and hold position. You will transmit a general recall to your vessels in this system. And you will come with us." He looked at me. I held the look. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then we have a much longer conversation," I said. "And your fleet keeps taking losses. And eventually one of 2 things happens, either we are overwhelmed here, or your fleet is. Neither of those outcomes is as clean as the one I'm offering you." He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The crew at the perimeter stations were still watching us. No one had moved. I do not know if that was training or shock or something else entirely. You came here to capture me, he said. Not to destroy this vessel. Not to damage the fleet. You specifically came for me. Yes. Because the galaxy is watching, he said. Yes, I said. And they need to see something different from what they saw before. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he looked around the bridge, at his crew, at the dome showing the stars and the distant battle, at the gray material walls of the ship that had never been violated before today, and something in his posture shifted, barely perceptible. You understand, he said, that even if I comply, you have not won a war. You have won a moment. I know, I said. Moments are how wars end. He stood up from the command seat. He was 3 meters tall, and standing, he filled the space in a way that made the room feel different. He looked at me from that height, and then he did something I did not expect. He gave an order in his own language. Owen, monitoring his translation system, said quietly in my earpiece, "Fleet recall. Cease engagement. Hold position. All vessels hold position." I did not let myself feel the relief yet. There was still too much to do. But somewhere in the back of my mind, I heard Colin laughing, the way he used to laugh when I told him something he did not believe, that open, genuine sound, and I held onto it, just for a second, before I started moving again. The stars outside the viewport of the shuttle looked different on the way back. I know that is not scientifically accurate. Stars do not change because of what happened below them. But something about the way I was seeing them had changed, and the result was the same. Vale sat across from me in the small cabin, flanked by 2 members of the insertion team, his large frame folded into a seat that was clearly too small for him. He had not spoken since we left the Eternal Throne. I had not tried to make him. We were 4 hours from the moon when he looked at me and said, without preamble, "What do you intend to do with me?" "Nothing harmful," I said. "You will be treated according to what we would want for our own people in the same position. You will be housed in appropriate conditions. You will have access to communication with your government. My government no longer has a clear chain of command," he said. Not bitterly. As a fact. I know. My withdrawal order and the fleet recall created a command vacuum, he said. My second-in-command does not have the authority to make independent decisions at this scale. The fleet will hold position, but it will not act, because no one below me has the clearance to authorize the next step in either direction. I know, I said again. He studied me. You planned for that. Victor planned for it. I just followed the plan. Victor. He seemed to be cataloging the name. Your general. One of them. He was quiet again for a while. Outside the viewport, the moon grew slowly larger. I could see the dark side now, and even from this distance I thought I could see the installation on it, though I knew that was probably imagination. 4,700 years, Vale said eventually. That is how long the Imperium has operated in its current form. In that time, we have integrated 212 species into our structure. Some willingly. Most not. And in that time, no species has done what you did. Boarded your flagship. Persisted, he said. The silver eyes were on me, and they were difficult to read, but I thought there was something genuine in them. We assessed you. We did so thoroughly. We knew your history. We knew your capacity for destruction. We knew your technology level and your political fragmentation and your biological limitations. We built a model of your likely response to our demonstration, and the model was accurate for the first 72 hours. Social disruption. Political paralysis. Fragmented response. And after 72 hours, you stopped being what the model predicted, he said. And we did not update the model in time. I thought about the factory workers running machines without managers. The engineers sleeping under their workbenches. Pete and his photo. Clara with her miner's hands. Arthur and his production summaries. You made a mistake, I said. You watched our surface. You saw what was happening in public. You didn't look underneath. We were not designed to, he said. And then, after a pause, we should have been. The moon filled the viewport. Ray brought us in on the approach vector and the installation resolved itself from a suggestion into a reality, the launch cradles and the vehicles and the lights of people still working, because they were always still working. Clara was at the airlock. She looked at Vale for a long moment, and then she looked at me, and she nodded once. That was enough. The next 3 months were the most complicated of my life, and that is saying a great deal given the previous months. The negotiation was not a negotiation in any conventional sense. It was more like a series of conversations held under enormous pressure between people who had every reason to distrust each other and kept finding, reluctantly, that understanding was more useful than anger. Vale was correct that the Imperium had lost its command clarity. The fleet held position outside the solar system, paralyzed by the absence of a valid order from above. His second-in-command, a woman named Keth, whose title translated roughly as Fleet Executor, made contact through Vale on the 4th day and asked for clarification on the situation. Vale, in my presence and with a human translator recording every word, told her the truth, that the Eternal Throne had been boarded, that he was in human custody, that the fleet should hold position and take no action until further notice. Keth's response took 11 hours to arrive. When it came, it was a single word in Imperium Standard that Vale translated for me himself, confirmed. 11 hours was a long time to wait for a one-word answer. I spent most of it talking to Victor, who was calmer than anyone had a right to be in the circumstances. He had a way of treating the unprecedented as merely the next item on a long list of items that needed to be dealt with, and I found it steadying even when it should not have been. The Imperium did not fracture because humanity destroyed it. The Imperium fractured because 16 vassal species, who had been watching the broadcast when the arrays fired, and watching the galaxy-wide transmission when Vale was taken, and watching everything in between, decided simultaneously that the terms of their integration into the Imperium were no longer ones they were willing to accept. Not because of us, exactly. Because of what we had demonstrated was possible. A species could say no. A species could pay the cost of saying no and still be there afterward. A species could look at something that had ruled for 4,000 years and say, not us, and then make that true. That message spread faster than our communications could track it. By the time the first session of what would become the Galactic Assembly was convened, 7 former Imperium vassal species had sent representatives. By the second session, 11. By the third, 16, plus 4 species who had never been Imperium vassals but had been watching from the edges and had decided the time was right to participate. The Eternal Throne, by my suggestion and Victor's agreement and eventually Vale's reluctant endorsement, was not destroyed or impounded. It was formally transferred to human custody and subsequently refitted. Not entirely. We left the bones of it intact, the vaulted corridors and the domed bridge and the gray material walls, because those things were what it was, and changing them would have been a lie about what had happened and how. But we added human quarters alongside the Imperium crew spaces, because the Eternal Throne still had its original crew, who had nowhere to go and had, over the months of negotiation, become something more complicated than prisoners and less than allies. A communications array calibrated to human frequencies. A common space midway through the ship where people from both species could sit and exist near each other without any requirement to do anything else. We renamed it. Not with a title or a designation. With a word in one of Earth's older languages that meant the act of continuing to exist after something tries to end you. Victor suggested it. I thought it was exactly right. The first session of the Galactic Assembly was held aboard the renamed ship, because it was the largest neutral venue available and because the symbolism was not lost on anyone. I was told I would speak for humanity. I argued against this, clearly and at length, explaining that I was a sergeant and a liaison officer and was not qualified to represent a species of 8 billion people. Victor listened to my argument with his usual patience and then said that was precisely why I was the right choice. I did not entirely follow his logic, but I did not have enough energy left to fight it. The chamber they used was the Eternal Throne's original assembly hall, a vast space capable of holding hundreds. It held maybe 60 that day, delegates and translators and observers, species I did not recognize and species I had learned about in the months since the broadcast, all seated in a rough circle in a room that still smelled faintly of the Imperium, that cool mineral scent that all their spaces had. Vale was present. He sat in the section allocated to Imperium representatives, which was smaller than it once would have been. He had spent 3 months in a position that no one in Imperium history had occupied, and it had changed something in his bearing, something subtle that I could not fully define. He was still precise, still took in a room with those silver eyes the way a lens takes in light. But there was something slightly less certain in the set of his shoulders, and I thought that uncertainty was honest. I stood and I spoke without notes, because I have never been able to talk properly when I am reading from a page. I said, "My name is Dara Osei. 6 months ago I was making coffee in an office building in Geneva. I am not a general, not a president, not a philosopher, not a scientist. I am the person they sent to speak for 8 billion people because they thought the truth should come from someone ordinary, and I am going to try to tell you that truth." I said, "We lost 1.2 billion people. Not a statistic. 1.2 billion individual human beings who woke up that morning and had things they were planning to do, things they were looking forward to, people they were going to see. They are gone in a way that is permanent, and we are going to carry that with us for the rest of our civilization's existence. Not as something that makes us angry, though it does make us angry. As something that matters. As something that we are obligated to remember and to name and to build into the center of who we are going forward." I said, "We are not the strongest species in this assembly. We are not the most advanced. We have been in space for a few decades compared to some of your centuries. We do not have the longest history or the deepest technology or the most refined philosophy. What we have is this: we do not stop. It is in our biology and our history and our stubbornness and probably our irrationality, as someone very tall once pointed out to me. We do not stop. We remember everything. We build things that outlast us. And when something tries to erase us, we have an unfortunate tendency to build something in response." I said, "We are not here to lead this assembly. We are here to participate in it. There is a difference. Leadership implies that we know better than you what should happen next. Participation means we are willing to sit in this room and argue and disagree and be wrong and be corrected and try again, for as long as it takes to figure out how a galaxy full of different kinds of life is supposed to share a galaxy." I looked around the room. I looked at the delegates who had come from species I would not have known existed 6 months ago, each one carrying their own story, their own losses, their own complicated history with the structure that had governed their existence. I looked at Vale. I said, and I will say this directly to the Imperium delegation, because they deserve to hear it clearly, and because I think Lord Commander Vale is someone who prefers clarity. What you did to our world was the worst thing that has been done to us in the whole of our recorded history. We are not going to pretend otherwise. We are not going to be diplomatic about the weight of it or soften the truth of what you took from us. And we are also not going to let it be the only thing that defines the next chapter of our story. Not because we are forgiving in the simple sense. Because we have something to build, and building it with you in the room is more useful than building it without you." I said, "The people we lost are part of everything we do from this point forward. Their names are in the memorial that is being built on the surface of our moon, not far from where we built the things that changed the outcome of this war. Every ship we launch from this point forward will carry their names. Every agreement we sign in this assembly will carry their names. We will not let them be erased by time any more than we let ourselves be erased by force." I looked at Vale one more time. He was looking at me. I said, "You told us, during the broadcast, that this was a demonstration for the whole galaxy. You wanted the whole galaxy to watch what happened to a species that would not surrender. Lord Commander, the whole galaxy is still watching. I hope they are seeing something different now." I stopped speaking. There was a silence in the chamber that lasted long enough that I started to wonder if I had said something wrong or missed a cultural protocol that required some kind of response from me. And then Vale stood up. He stood up in that chamber, 3 meters tall, in the ship that had once been his, surrounded by representatives of species who had once been subjects of his empire, and he bowed his head. It was a small gesture. A slight inclination, nothing theatrical. But B, who was sitting in the second row with the rest of the insertion team, told me afterward that she had been monitoring the translation feeds from the other delegations, and that the Imperium gesture of head inclination carried a precise meaning in their language. It meant, I acknowledge something I did not expect to encounter. I thought that was enough for a start. The assembly did not solve everything that day. It did not come close. What it did was establish the habit of sitting in a room together, which is a more difficult thing to establish than it sounds. Over the months and years that followed, there were arguments and walkouts and failed negotiations and moments where it seemed like the whole structure would collapse, and it did not collapse, because each time it came close, someone would stay in the room 1 hour longer than was comfortable, and someone else would match them, and the thing would hold. We named our first new ship after the memorial, not as a title but as a reminder. Victor got the command. He was not a person who looked for recognition, and the last time I saw him he was already planning the next set of problems, a long list that covered 3 full screens, the way it always had, the way it always would. Clara went back to engineering. She started a project to build a permanent human presence on the Martian surface, which she described to me in a message with characteristic understatement as a slightly larger version of the moon thing. She sent updates occasionally. They were always competent and always brief. Owen became a translator. He was good at it. He had the instinct for the gap between what a word meant technically and what it meant in context, which is the only instinct that actually matters in that work. B went into ship design. I heard later that one of the structural principles she developed for crew endurance became standard across the joint fleet. Ray went home. He had a family in the north of England, a husband and 2 daughters, and he had been away from them for 8 months, and he got into a shuttle the morning after the assembly and did not look back. I respected that enormously. Pete, I never saw again after the moon. I thought about him sometimes, about the photo in his visor, about the way he had run that cable junction with the focused quiet of someone who had found exactly the right way to put his grief to use. I hoped he found his way back to somewhere that felt like home. And me. I went back to Geneva. My flat was still there. My neighbor Edna had kept Pepper alive and well and had apparently developed a genuine affection for the cat, which created a small negotiation about custody that was, in its way, more complicated than anything I had done in the assembly chamber. We settled it by agreeing that Pepper would spend alternating weeks at each flat, which Pepper seemed to accept with the complete indifference that cats bring to all arrangements made on their behalf. I sat at my window the first evening back, looking at the lake, with Pepper on the arm of the chair beside me, and I thought about Colin, the way I always did, the way I always will. I thought about the last thing he had texted me, 3 days before the broadcast, a message about a patient he had helped that day and a joke at the end that had made me laugh on a Tuesday afternoon in a way I had not expected. I had the text saved. I had it memorized. I had it in a way that was not the same as having him, but was the one thing I could hold on to. 1.2 billion names. And every single one of them was someone like Colin, someone with a last message and a laugh and a thing they were planning and a person who was going to miss them every day for the rest of their life. We carried them with us. That was the promise. That was the whole point. Outside the window, the Geneva evening was quiet and cool and very old, the kind of city that had survived things before and kept going, and above it, if you knew where to look in the dark between the stars, there was a fleet that had not been there 6 months ago, and a ship with a new name, and a room full of different kinds of life arguing about what came next. It was not a perfect world. It was not a solved galaxy. It was a beginning. And we were very, very good at those.